Subscribe before the truth disappears. Because some doors don't just lock people in, they erase them. At 3:17 a.m. in the high desert of Colorado, the lights inside ADX Florence didn't go out. They didn't flicker either. They simply shifted. One long, unnatural dimming across a corridor built to never feel uncertain. A silent alarm pulsed through the facility's nervous system. Not a siren, not yet, just a change in the air that the building itself seemed to recognize. On the range known for holding men who no longer belonged in the normal world, heavy steel doors sat in perfect alignment, like teeth. Every cell was a box inside a box, each seam designed to resist tampering, each hinge engineered to endure years of pressure and hate. The corridors were clean in the clinical way that made time feel stalled. Concrete, steel, and the low hum of ventilation that never stopped. And then on one of the overhead cameras, a rectangle of darkness appeared where there shouldn't have been any darkness at all. The control room caught it first. A panel flashed a warning that read, "Video loss, Cam 4C, service corridor." No explanation, no cause, just absence. Inside a prison that promised complete sight, something had blinked. The first response was automatic. Doors refused to open, movement halted. The building tightened around its occupants the way a fist closes. An officer's boot struck the floor with urgency, the sound sharp against the corridor's stillness. Two more followed. No shouting, no radio chatter spilling into the range, only clipped murmurs and the dull click of equipment being checked. They moved toward the service corridor where Cam 4C should have been watching. They never saw the person who was already there. His name was Dylan Kerr, 29, not long out of training, still new enough to take pride in routine. He'd been assigned to overnight rounds, the kind of shift that taught a person the difference between boredom and dread. At ADX Florence, even boredom came with rules. Dylan passed through a sally port, one of those controlled choke points where two doors were never open at the same time. He scanned his badge. The reader blinked green. The first door opened, the second waited, as it always did, as if thinking. When it finally released, Dylan stepped into the service corridor. Then, the camera went dark. In the control room, a technician called it a drop. A brief loss, maybe a cable, maybe moisture in a connection. Something small, something fixable. At ADX Florence, small didn't exist. The corridor itself carried no smell besides disinfectant and cold air. Pipes ran overhead like veins. The lights were recessed, protected, and uniform, designed to leave nowhere for shadows to gather. Yet a shadow had gathered anyway. Dylan's radio remained quiet, not because he wasn't speaking, but because nothing transmitted from that corridor anymore. Like the air itself had been padded. At 3:20 a.m., a supervisor tapped a screen and brought up the redundant feed. Another camera angle, another promise of coverage. It showed the corridor's far end, empty. The view was clean and still, as if nobody had entered at all. The building insisted nothing was wrong. Then, a door sensor pinged. Unscheduled open, utility access 12. A panel no one used during normal operations, a door that should have remained sealed behind protocols and requiring two separate credentials. The system registered it for less than 2 seconds, open, then closed. A human heartbeat is longer than that. The facility went to full lockdown. Somewhere deep in the building, a low warning tone began to throb. Not loud enough to panic the population, but distinct enough to tell anyone who worked there the prison was tightening. In cells designed to swallow sound, inmates lay on bunks under cold lighting, faces turned toward door slots that revealed nothing. At ADX Florence, even the architecture discouraged communication. Most men spent 23 hours a day alone, leaving their cells only in restraints, only in controlled bursts. They had no way of seeing what was happening, but they felt it. Down the range, behind a different set of doors, a man named Mateo Rivas sat on the edge of his concrete bed, hands resting on his knees like he was trying not to move too quickly. He had been a logistics man for a cartel, someone who never fired a weapon in public, never raised his voice, and still moved more violence than most men protected by guns. Now he lived inside a cell engineered to make violence feel impossible. The slot in his door opened. A meal tray slid in. Mateo didn't reach for it right away. He looked at the corner of his cell where the camera stared down like a single unblinking eye. Then he blinked twice, slowly, deliberately. Nothing else. On another continent, thousands of miles away, a different prison was finishing its own overnight count. Black Dolphin Prison in Russia sat remote and heavy, a place designed to break rhythm and hope. The corridors were narrower, the air colder, the security rituals older. Men there were moved bent forward, hands cuffed, heads lowered, an enforced posture that turned bodies into compliance. In a dim stairwell outside a wing known for housing life sentence inmates, a motion sensor tripped. A light clicked on. The stairwell was empty. The sensor tripped again, like something invisible was pacing. And then, as if linked by a thread nobody could see, the security system logged an error that was almost identical to the one in Colorado. Video loss, stairwell B2. Across the Atlantic, in southern Illinois, USP Marion slept in winter darkness. It was quieter than it had been decades earlier, but its walls still carried the legacy of violence, one of the prisons that helped shape America's modern supermax ideas. Here, too, movement was controlled, schedules were rigid, and the building was built like a lesson. At 3:31 a.m., a control desk operator noticed a minor discrepancy. An electronic door that reported secured, while a pressure sensor beneath it suggested weight. Like a foot holding it, like something keeping it from fully sealing. Again, a problem too small to ignore. In all three prisons, the staff responded the same way, by locking everything down harder. Back at ADX Florence, the response team reached the service corridor. The first officer swept a flashlight beam over pipes and valves. The light found nothing. The concrete underfoot was clean. No scuff marks, no debris. It looked undisturbed in the way that only maintained institutions can look, sterile, controlled. And then the second officer saw it. A badge lay on the floor near the utility access panel. Dylan's badge. It wasn't torn, it wasn't snapped. It rested flat, perfectly placed like a dropped playing card, the photo facing up. That alone was wrong. Staff didn't drop badges. Not here. Not in a building that treated simple mistakes like threats. The third officer spoke Dylan's name into his radio. No reply. They checked the utility access panel. The door was sealed. The locking mechanism showed no signs of tampering. A heavy metal strip sat flush against the wall like it had never moved. Yet the system log insisted it had opened. Inside the control room, they pulled up the access history on Dylan's badge. The timestamp that appeared was impossible. Badge used, cam system login 03/18/12. Not a door, not a sally port, a camera system login. From a terminal that was supposed to exist outside the secure control area. From somewhere inside the facility where no terminals were located. In a prison built for zero escape, someone had just touched the eyes. And as the supervisor stared at Dylan's photo on the screen, another line unfolded beneath it. An automated cross-check, the kind meant to catch duplicates and fraud. It returned a name, not Dylan Kerr, a different officer ID attached to the same badge signature, like a ghost following the data. A man who, according to the personnel database, had died 6 years ago. And in that moment, as ADX Florence held its breath behind reinforced doors and silent corridors, the truth became something more frightening than an escape attempt. It wasn't the inmates trying to get out. It was someone, already inside, moving freely through the one place built to make freedom impossible. By dawn, ADX Florence looked unchanged from the outside. Low, pale structures crouched in the Colorado scrubland, surrounded by fences that seemed to multiply the closer you got. But inside, the prison had entered a different mode of existence. Lockdown didn't arrive with drama. It arrived like winter. Air handlers kept pushing cold, filtered air through sealed corridors. Lights stayed steady. Stainless steel surfaces held their reflections without distortion. And everywhere, doors stayed shut, reinforced steel slabs seated into frames so precisely that even sound struggled to pass. Somewhere within that precision, Dylan Kerr had vanished. His absence quickly became measurable, not in his empty chair, not in a missing name on a roster, but in the small mechanical rhythms he had stopped feeding. A door no longer opening when scheduled, a clock-in that never happened, a radio that never answered back. In the control room, the supervisor, an experienced man with a face softened by years of artificial light, watched the facility's digital heartbeat on a wall of monitors. ADX Florence presented itself as a grid of certainty. Camera feeds, door statuses, motion indicators, and access logs that left no room for folklore. But the log line they couldn't stop staring at wasn't a story, it was a fact. A camera system login, timestamped at 03/18/12, attached to Dylan's badge signature, cross-matched to an officer whose files said deceased. In a building that didn't tolerate ambiguity, it was the purest kind of contamination. They cut the corridor feeds over to redundancy. They isolated the segment where Cam 4C had gone dark. They locked down every utility access panel connected to that area. They ran the interlocks in a loop, slick with caution. Door 1 closed, door 2 locked, doors refusing to share even a second of openness. And still, the air felt wrong. Not supernatural, not haunted, just compromised. Because prisons like ADX Florence don't rely on one lock. They rely on layers that assume no single layer will ever be perfect. Steel doors, yes, but also procedures, permissions, and patterns. The real cage isn't only concrete and metal, it's choreography. And someone had stepped into the choreography like they knew the dance. The missing video feed was the cleanest warning. Camera loss should have triggered alarms loud enough to wake the entire facility. Instead, it had behaved like a maintenance drop, brief, plausible, almost polite. That kind of failure didn't happen by accident. It happened when the system believed it was allowed. At 06:40 a.m., the first shift change arrived into a facility that wouldn't let them move. Officers queued through security checkpoints and found their normal flow broken into fragments. Small groups held behind glass, IDs verified twice, radios swapped, pouches checked, pockets emptied of anything that could be used as a tool. Even the routine had been placed in restraints. The warden walked the main corridor without raising his voice. His posture was calm, but the building's behavior wasn't. Doors hesitated longer before releasing. Some keypads required a second scan. In one hallway, a light panel blinked once and steadied, as if catching itself. Nothing in his face suggested panic, but everyone could feel the prison listening. Down in his cell, Mateo Rivas marked the change without seeing it. He didn't need a calendar. He tracked time by sound. The cartwheels, the distant click of a trace lock, the faint shift in air pressure when doors opened and closed far away. That morning, the tray arrived late. The slot slid open with its usual reluctant scrape.
A tray appeared. The slot closed. Mateo waited. He kept his hands off the tray long enough to show the ceiling camera he wasn't reaching for anything hidden underneath. Then he leaned down. Carved into the foam cup lid with something sharp was a single symbol, two parallel lines crossed by a diagonal slash. It was small, crude, and deeply out of place. Mateo stared at it longer than he should have. That symbol wasn't cartel code. It wasn't prison graffiti. It looked like an internal mark, utilitarian, the kind of shorthand used by people who treat a building like a machine. A minute later, the cup was gone, slid back out through the slot as though the symbol had never existed. On paper, the day continued. Meals, counts, silence. But the facility's hidden life accelerated. In the secure server closet, sealed behind its own access control and protected by locks that aren't visible to most staff, someone initiated a configuration change. It wasn't done openly, not under a name anyone would proudly attach it to. It was done under a generic service account, one of those accounts created for maintenance, system admin, vendor support, facility IT, accounts that exist because modern prisons depend on technology the way lungs depend on air. The change was subtle. A permission flag toggled from deny to allow for a set of diagnostic modes on cameras and doors in one wing. Diagnostic modes are the compromises of the real world. They exist because equipment needs testing, because updates need validation, because alarms sometimes misfire and have to be checked without detonating the entire facility. Diagnostic modes are guarded carefully, but they are still doors. At 09:12 a.m. in USP Marion, another quiet anomaly appeared. A staff member assigned to a restricted unit failed to appear at a checkpoint. It was not the kind of absence that could be explained by oversleeping or a late commute. The door log showed him passing one controlled threshold and never reaching the next. There were no signs of struggle, no noise, no broken seals. Just a human being removed from a timeline. By 10:30 a.m. local time in Russia, Black Dolphin's corridors had already tightened. Guards moved with the same rigid rituals, heads down for inmates, hands visible, steps counted. The prison's design was older, its methods harsher, but its dependence on systems was just as real. A stairwell camera that had failed in the night came back online, but its timestamp drifted, lagging behind by minutes, then catching up in a jump. In secure environments, time itself is a form of control. When time becomes unreliable, everything gets sharp. Back in Colorado, ADX Florence began to do what it was built to do in crisis: separate and contain. Work orders were frozen, contractors were barred, tool inventories were counted, then counted again. Maintenance carts were staged and sealed. Even the smallest screwdriver became a potential story. But the most dangerous tools weren't in pockets. They were in credentials. Dylan's badge had been found like a calling card, and the badge signature, its unique electronic fingerprint, was now behaving like a shared identity. That shouldn't have been possible. Modern access control systems don't simply accept copies. They measure timing, encryption, rolling codes. They assume the badge you hold is the badge you have, unless the system is told otherwise. Unless the badge is no longer the key, but merely the costume. And the confidence lives elsewhere, in an administrator panel, in a backdoor account, in a database that decides what is true. At 1:47 p.m., the control room received a new alert. Not a door, not a camera. A file movement. Personnel database export, 1.2 gigabytes, destination unknown. It showed as a normal administrative function. Routine backups happen, audits happen. But this export occurred out of schedule, out of pattern. And it used the credentials of the same officer listed as deceased. The warden ordered the internal network segmented, cutting wings into digital islands. It was an old rule applied to new machinery. If something is sick, isolate it before it spreads. For a brief stretch, it seemed like it might work. Then the building did something that made even seasoned staff stop breathing for a second. At 2:06 p.m., a door opened.
It wasn't a main gate. It wasn't a perimeter fence. It wasn't anything that signaled an escape. It was smaller than that, more intimate, deeper inside the facility. A Sallyport door on a restricted movement path released for exactly 2 seconds. The log recorded it cleanly. Door 3B outer, open-close, 00002. No accompanying authorization, no escort movement scheduled, no emergency override declared. In a prison built on routines, it was a stutter in the sentence. Officers moved fast, not running, never running. Running creates noise, and noise creates chaos, but their urgency was unmistakable. The corridor cameras showed them arriving in the pairs, their bodies angled defensively, hands poised near restraints and radios, eyes scanning corners that offered nowhere to hide. And then the second, stranger confirmation arrived. A head count discrepancy. One inmate in a high-security wing was registering present in the digital system, but absent in the physical count. The screen still showed him secured, in place, no movement. The cell, when they looked, was empty. The bed was made in the prison's simple, flat style. The sink was dry. The toilet untouched. No broken fixtures. No bent metal. No tool marks. No human being. Only the camera in the corner, still recording, still blinking, still showing a version of the cell where nothing had changed. In the control room, the supervisor replayed the feed. He watched the cell from the same angle, the same lighting, the same dead calm. For hours, the inmate appeared to be there, barely moving, just a shape on the bunk. Then, at 1:59 p.m., the image did something subtle and terrifying. It froze. Not the whole screen, just the inmate. The air vent continued to vibrate slightly. A faint shadow from the overhead light continued to hold its place. The timestamp continued to advance, but the figure on the bunk became a still photograph masquerading as a live feed. Someone hadn't just blinded the prison. They had taught it to lie. And inside that lie, inside the 2 seconds of an opened door and the hours of a falsified camera view, someone had moved through an impossible place as if it were ordinary. By late afternoon, ADX Florence had become a sealed organism with a missing piece. Dylan Kerr was still gone. A dead man's credentials were still moving invisibly through the system. And now, an inmate had disappeared without an alarm loud enough to shake the walls. In a facility engineered for zero escape, the most frightening discovery wasn't that someone could get out. It was that someone could move people around like objects, silently, cleanly, and on purpose. And as the warden stood in the sterile corridor outside the empty cell, the lights above him held steady, until they dimmed in the same slow, unnatural way they had at 3:17 a.m. This time, every camera in the wing went dark at once, and in the blackness, a single door, somewhere deeper inside the prison, unlocked with a soft, precise click.
The blackout didn't feel like a failure. It felt like a decision. In the restricted wing at ADX Florence, darkness rolled across the cameras in a clean sweep, as if someone had pulled a curtain over the building's eyes. Emergency lighting stayed on, thin, cold strips that painted the corridor and faint gray, but the screens in the control room turned into a wall of blank rectangles. For a few seconds, the prison became what it was never supposed to be, a place with corners. Officers moved anyway. They didn't shout, they didn't run. Their boots made quick, controlled sounds on concrete as they formed up in the corridor, shoulders tight, hands ready, radios pressed close as if volume alone could summon control back into the air. Somewhere deeper inside, a lock released with a soft mechanical click, precise, almost gentle. A door that should have required 2 separate credentials and a timed release unlocked without a human hand on the other side. At ADX Florence, doors were not supposed to surprise anyone. The warden watched the digital map in the control room degrade in real time. With the camera feeds down, the prison fell back on its other senses: door sensors, pressure plates, motion pings. Little green indicators flickered across the layout like distant fireflies. Then, one indicator moved. Not an inmate, not an officer, not a scheduled escort. A credential signature. That same badge fingerprint, Dylan Kerr's badge, wearing the ghost of a dead officer's name, traveled through the facility's restricted interior as if it belonged there. It hit one access point, then another. It didn't pause the way a real person pauses. It didn't hesitate at interlocks. It flowed along the building's veins with the confidence of something that already knew what it would be allowed to do. At 2:11 p.m., a service hatch on an interior maintenance corridor registered open. At 2:12 p.m., a secured utility camera, one that had never failed in its recorded history, went into diagnostic mode. At 2:13 p.m., the pressure sensor beneath a sally port door read "held" for 2 seconds and then released. Each event was small enough to explain away in a normal facility. Here, each one was a confession. In his cell, Mateo Rivas felt the building change again. The air moved differently when the ventilation dampers adjusted for containment. Somewhere far away, steel met steel with a slow, heavy sound that was never part of the daily rhythm. He didn't know why it was happening. He only knew it wasn't for him. Yet. When the meal slot opened this time, the tray that slid in wasn't his. It held a different unit number on the tag, written in ink that looked fresh. A mistake that didn't happen in a place where the smallest mistake could become an incident. Mateo stared at it, then at the ceiling camera, then at the metal door that divided him from the corridor. He didn't touch the tray. He waited. The slot closed again. The tray vanished as quickly as it had arrived. On the other side of that door, the corridor remained quiet. But within the facility's hidden spaces, behind access panels and in service runs that most staff never walked, someone was moving with purpose. The architects of Supermax prisons designed the visible world to eliminate improvisation. Straight corridors, controlled choke points, no crowding, no blind stairwells that aren't covered by cameras. The invisible world is different. Every prison has to breathe. It has to route power, water, data, and air. It has to provide maintenance access to the machines that keep the place alive. And those paths, utility corridors, crawl spaces, ceiling voids, exist for function, not for control. They are still locked down, but they are built. The door that had clicked open, quiet and forbidden, led into one of those spaces. Under emergency lighting, officers reached the entrance and found nothing dramatic. No smashed lock, no obvious forced entry. Just a handle that now turned when it shouldn't have. They moved through, flashlights cutting across bolts, pipes, and metal trays for cabling. The air smelled like coal dust and faint ozone. Their beams jumped from junction boxes to stainless steel panels, searching for anything that didn't belong. Then they found it, a thin, new cable run piggybacked along older wiring, taped in place with clean black adhesive. It led to a junction box that had been opened and resealed with screws, turned just slightly too fresh. A network tap. A quiet parasite feeding off the prison's nervous system. At the end of the cable, tucked behind a removable panel, sat a small, hard case no bigger than a lunchbox. Inside it, a compact device blinked with steady patience, pulling data and pushing commands as if it had always been part of the building. On its side, written in white marker,
were two parallel lines crossed by a diagonal slash, the same crude symbol Mateo had seen carved in the cup lid. This wasn't random. This was marked. The warden didn't speak loudly when the device was carried into the control room. He didn't need to. The room had filled with the kind of silence that comes when a place realizes it has been touched where it is most sensitive. The device had no prison inventory tag, no facility label, no work order associated with it. It was an object placed deliberately in one of the most secure buildings on Earth, and whoever placed it had done so without leaving the kind of mess most criminals couldn't help making. That night, long before Dylan Kerr ever missed a radio check, he had already been compromised in quieter ways. He had been living a normal life outside the walls, cheap apartment, long shifts, the fatigue of a job that never stopped being tense. He had also been carrying the kind of private pressure that turns people into leverage, debt that didn't come from luxury but from slow accumulation, a loan to cover a family emergency, a second loan to cover the first, a gambling app on his phone that promised quick turns and delivered slow ruin. By the time the prison lights dimmed at 3:17 a.m., Dylan's life had already been narrowed down to one choice: cooperate or be crushed. The people who approached him didn't need to threaten him with violence. They threatened him with collapse, with the kind of humiliation that spreads through a life like mold: lost job, lost clearance, lost future. They offered him something that sounded like relief: a way out, a clean slate, a payday big enough to reset his world. They also told him, calmly, that they knew exactly how the prison worked, and that if he didn't help, it would happen anyway, just messier. When Dylan stepped into the service corridor and the camera went dark, he wasn't dragged screaming. He wasn't ambushed by a faceless stranger with a knife. He walked, because he believed he could survive it, because he believed the building would protect him from consequences it didn't even know how to see. In a hidden maintenance room behind a blank wall panel, an old space meant for spare filters and electrical parts, Dylan was kept alive, sedated, fed water, used like a living token, not for fingerprints, not for his face, for his access pattern. Because somewhere in the system, his badge signature had been paired to a credential ghost, an account built years earlier during a security upgrade, an admin identity that outlived its original owner. A dead man's name, a living back door. When officers finally reached that room, they found Dylan slumped against a wall, wrists cuffed in plastic restraints, eyes swollen with exhaustion and chemical sleep. The air was stale, the floor was clean, the scene looked less like a kidnapping and more like careful storage. But Dylan was only half of what had been taken. The missing inmate was still gone. In the hours the cameras had lied, that inmate had been moved through the utility world, through corridors that weren't meant for people, toward a door that opened for 2 seconds at exactly the right time. Not long enough for a crowd, just long enough for one restrained body and 2 practiced hands. No one needed to breach the perimeter fence. They only needed the prison to briefly believe the perimeter wasn't relevant. At 4:26 p.m., a maintenance vehicle that didn't draw attention left the inner service area, an unremarkable box truck used for facility supply movement. It passed through gates that had been told, digitally, to trust it. Its driver wore standard-issue clothing. Its paperwork in the system looked clean. It disappeared into the scrubland beyond the last fence with the same quiet inevitability of any other routine movement. By the time the prison's network was fully segmented and the camera feeds began to return, one by one, blinking back into existence like waking eyes, the truck was already on open road. That night, the same pattern echoed in the other facilities.
At USP Marion, the missing staff member was located in a locked storage corridor, alive, disoriented, restrained with zip ties that looked like they'd been pulled from a professional kit. A small device was found behind a ceiling panel, marked with the same crude symbol. At Black Dolphin, the stairwell camera came back online and then promptly began recording a perfect loop of empty steps, over and over, just enough to convince a bored eye that nothing was wrong. A network junction box showed fresh tape residue where it had been opened and resealed. Different countries, different prisons, same fingerprint. Not an escape plan. An extraction method. The next morning, ADX Florence looked normal again. Lights steady, corridors sterile, cameras live, doors obeying their rules. The kind of normal that reassures the public. Inside, staff moved with a new caution that didn't fade with caffeine or daylight. They checked ceiling panels. They looked twice at sealed screws. They listened to doors the way you listen to a house at night after you've heard a window creak. And in his cell, Mateo Rivas sat on the edge of his concrete bed, eyes fixed on the corner camera. He hadn't been taken. Not yet. But he understood something now that felt colder than any threat. The building could be convinced to let people move through it. The prison's strength wasn't only steel, it was trust. And trust could be rewritten. 3 days later, after the facility issued internal assurances and tightened procedures, a single line appeared in the access logs at 03:18:12 a.m. again. Same time, same signature, same dead man's account. Only this time, it didn't target cameras or doors. It targeted the roster. A list of names in high-security housing. A short list. And next to one of those names, a small note appeared in the system. Clean, typed, impossible to trace to a normal console. Next. If you thought this one was wild, wait for the next. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the safest prison in the world gets taught to blink.